Okay, so imagine this. The global financial system, the one that shapes all of our lives, wasn't born in some shiny, pristine boardroom. Nope, it was forged in the final, chaotic days of a world war. For 80 years, a single meeting has defined our economic world. It created an age of unbelievable growth, but it also, and this is the key, contained the seeds of its own collapse. So today, we're going to break down the story of the Bretton Woods system, from its desperate birth to the huge battle that's raging over its future right now.
So let's just start right here, because this question really gets to the heart of everything. You see, the leaders of the Allied nations didn't meet in some grand palace. They gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire, a place so neglected that workers were apparently told to just paint it white if a fixture was stuck. In that chaotic setting, it was a perfect mirror of the world at the time. The reason they met there, in that mess, is simple. The world was absolutely, positively desperate.
I mean, the 1930s had been a complete and utter disaster. The Great Depression set off this wave of economic nationalism that basically tore the world apart. So in 1944, these leaders weren't just trying to design a new financial system, they were desperately trying to build a firewall against another world war. They knew they couldn't let it happen again.
And the absolute core of the problem was this really toxic philosophy, beggar thy neighbor. It's this idea that your country can solve its own economic problems by making things worse for everybody else. And this wasn't some fringe idea, this was mainstream policy, and it was pushing the entire world toward a catastrophe.
So what did this actually look like in practice? Well, you had countries locked in this vicious race to the bottom. They'd deliberately devalue their currencies to make their own stuff artificially cheap, and at the same time, they'd slap these massive tariffs on anything coming in from other countries. And the result? It was a death spiral for global trade. Economies were cratering and international tensions were just skyrocketing.
And you can see the whole disastrous story laid out right here. You can literally trace a direct line from the economic failures after World War I through the chaos of the 30s, straight to the battlefields of World War II. By 1944, it was painfully obvious that economic cooperation wasn't some nice-to-have luxury. No, it was absolutely essential for peace.
But agreeing that a system was needed, that was the easy part. Deciding what that system should actually look like, well, that sparked an intense intellectual battle, a real showdown, personified by two brilliant, strong-willed economists who represented two very, very different national interests.
And this slide really gets to the fundamental clash at the heart of the conference. On one side, you've got Britain's John Maynard Keynes. He's representing a nation that's deeply in debt after the war. So he proposes this bold, kind of radical plan for a global central bank and a totally new currency. But on the other side, you have America's Harry Dexter White. The U.S. was the world's dominant creditor, right? It held most of the gold. His plan was much more conservative, creating a fund that was centered on the U.S. dollar, backed by all that gold.
And this whole battle of ideas, it took place in total chaos. The hotel was so overcrowded that delegates were literally sleeping in closets. The acoustics were terrible. Keynes himself called the whole thing a monstrous monkey house. It was in that pressure cooker that our modern financial world was forged. Crazy, right?
But out of that chaos, a decision was made. And it wasn't based on the best idea necessarily, but on cold, hard power. America's economic might won the day, and the final agreement was overwhelmingly based on the White Plan. This chart here just perfectly captures that new power dynamic. In the newly created International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the United States started with nearly a third of the voting power. That gave it dominant influence from day one.
Now, what followed was a period of unbelievable global prosperity. People often call it the golden age of capitalism. The system worked. It created stability, it fostered trade, but, and this is a huge but, built into its very architecture was a fatal contradiction, a ticking clock that would eventually bring the whole thing crashing down.
The system itself was actually beautifully simple. First, every country fixed its currency's value to the US dollar. Simple enough. Second, the US promised to fix the dollar's value to gold at a set rate of $35 an ounce. And the crucial point here is that this made the dollar the world's undisputed anchor currency. It was the one currency that was as good and as convertible as gold itself.
And that leads us to the system's central, fatal question. I mean, think about it. For global trade to grow, the world needed a constantly growing supply of dollars. But the U.S. only had a finite amount of gold. Do you see the problem? This wasn't some hypothetical flaw. It was a ticking time bomb at the very heart of the global economy.
This problem actually has a name, the Triffin Dilemma.
The U.S. was completely trapped. It was a classic catch-22. To fuel global trade, America had to pump dollars into the world economy, which meant running deficits. But the more dollars it printed, the less believable its promise to back them all with gold became. Every single dollar printed for global growth was a tiny little chip away at global confidence. It was a paradox with no easy solution at all.
So, by the late 1960s, a combination of massive spending on the Vietnam War and domestic programs just caused the number of dollars overseas to explode. Confidence was plummeting. That ticking clock that was planted way back in 1944 was about to go off, and it happened in a single dramatic moment that we now call the Nixon Shock.
This bar chart lays out the crisis in really stark terms. Just look at it. By 1971, foreign central banks held about 3 times more U.S. dollars than the U.S. had in gold reserves to back them up. Countries like France started getting really nervous, even sending warships to New York Harbor to demand their gold back. A bank run on the United States itself was beginning.
So President Richard Nixon huddled with his advisors at Camp David, and he made a radical, unilateral decision. On the evening of August 15, 1971, he went on television and, with just a few words, ended an entire economic era.
And with that one single announcement, the core promise of the Bretton Woods system was broken. Nixon announced the U.S. would no longer convert dollars to gold. The anchor was cut loose. And this didn't just end the system, it ushered in the world of floating exchange rates we live in today, where currency values shift against each other every single second, creating both new opportunities and a whole lot of new volatility.
Which, of course, brings us to today. The world has changed so dramatically since 1944. The system that was built for post-war reconstruction is now facing 21st century crises it was never designed for. Things like climate change, pandemics, and staggering debt. There's a growing consensus that the old architecture is, and this is a direct quote, entirely unfit for purpose.
The sheer scale of the new challenges is just staggering. Look at this number, $5.4 trillion. That is the annual financing gap that developing countries are facing just to meet basic goals for health, education, and climate action. The existing system, as it stands, simply cannot meet this demand. It's not even close.
So what's the answer? Well, one path forward is to fundamentally reform the institutions we already have from the inside. This is the goal of something called the Bridgetown Initiative. It's calling for some really bold systemic changes, massively scaling up lending, automatically pausing a country's debt payments after a climate disaster, and even creating new global taxes to help fund global needs.
But there's another path emerging. You see, a lot of major emerging economies, led by the BRICS nations, are frustrated with the slow pace of reform. So they're building their own parallel institutions. And this table clearly shows the difference in philosophy. Where the IMF often demands painful austerity measures for its loans, the BRICS' New Development Bank focuses on infrastructure with fewer strings attached. This isn't just about money. It's a geopolitical statement. It's about creating a multipolar financial world that's no longer dominated by a single power.
And that brings us to the crucial question facing the world today. Are we going to forge a new global bargain, reinventing that cooperative spirit of 1944 for the incredibly complex challenges of the 21st century? Or are we just witnessing the fragmentation of the global economy into competing and potentially conflicting economic blocs? The next 80 years of global prosperity could very well depend on how we answer that question.